Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Today, we've got two Indigenous authors on the pod who coincidentally make the same bleakly wry observation that it's a miracle there are any Indigenous people here at all in the Americas. In a bit, we'll hear about the book Probably Ruby, which is about an Indigenous baby who gets raised by a white family and gets into all the baggage that affords. But first, The Only Good Indians is a book by Stephen Graham Jones, who's a member of the Blackfeet Nation. He dabbles mostly in horror, and in this interview with NPR's Ari Shapiro, he talks about how he feels like the mainstream literati want to pigeonhole Native writers into writing, a certain type of literary fiction. But he gives a pretty fascinating argument as to why he likes to play in the genres, horror in particular.
Stephen Graham Jones writes horror novels, and his latest starts with a provocative reworking of an old saying. The title is The Only Good Indians.
The only good Indians are dead Indians from, it's ascribed to Teddy Roosevelt back in the 19th century, but it was kind of the bumper sticker that would have been on horses if horses had bumper stickers back then.
Jones is a member of the Blackfeet Nation, and in this book, a group of friends violates a tradition on the reservation, and a vengeful spirit haunts them to the bloody end. I began by asking Stephen Graham Jones about the title, why he wanted to explore the idea of good Indians.
I wanted to interrogate what it means to even be a good Indian in 2020, It doesn't mean, subscribing to old ways. Does it mean adopting other ways? How do you navigate the world when success in one arena is failure in another? And it turns out there's not a single way to be a good Indian. There's 7 million ways to be a good Indian.
Except in this book, there's a very clear way to be a bad one, and it results in this horror story of, vengeance, right?
It does, yeah. Yeah, these guys overstep their boundaries.
Tell us about that initial trespass. I mean, what is the violation here?
These four elk hunters, on the last day of their elk hunt, they kind of consider that all bets are off, and they sneak into the elder section, which is saved for the elders of the tribe to hunt, so they can have access to easier elk. And they sneak into the elder section and shoot a lot more elk than they need.
So what is it about this trespass of hunting elk in the section that is reserved for the elders and shooting more elk than you need that you think makes such a powerful, instigating event?
You're basically taking food off of elders' plates, and that, to me, is no way to be part of a community, of course.
What made you want to center this around the spirit of the elk?
I think the reason elk matter to me, it's whenever I take an elk or I'm part of a hunting party that takes an elk, I feel like there's an ethical obligation to that animal to treat it with respect. And I feel that to every animal that I might take out in the field, of course, but generally we're out after elk. And so, if I were a rabbit hunter, then maybe this would be a novel about rabbits, but I mostly go after elk. So this turned out to be an elk novel.
Is any of this an exorcism of your own guilt for elk that you've killed in your life and felt like you didn't do justice to?
A little bit, yeah. In 2008, I moved from Texas to Colorado, and an elk I had got the previous year I still had some of her meat in the freezer. And when I moved away, I had to go door to door and give the elk away to my neighbors because I couldn't transport it, up to Colorado. And
that scene is exactly in this novel.
It totally is.
That's a direct, wow.
And I felt so guilty about that because I had told her when I shot her that I'm sorry this had to happen, but I'm gonna make use of you. You're gonna do good for me and my kids,
But the food wasn't put to waste. You did give it to people who I'm trying to assuage your guilt, I guess, but it sounds like you did the responsible thing.
I tried to. I don't know what they did with the elk, Hopefully they all ate it and had wonderful meals, and she just cycled back into the herd,
Among the various stories of Native experience, what do you think a horror story adds to the mix?
The marketplace or the critical establishment, they kind of want American Indian fiction or literature to stay close to what's considered like the main trunk of literature, I guess, where we don't get to go out on the branches and play in science fiction and fantasy and horror. And I think it's really important for us to run out on all the skinny branches we can and claim whatever we want,
Yeah. Well, what is it about this particular skinny branch that you think bears fruit that another branch might not?
For me, the slasher is a wonderful model I mean, it's a wonderful thing to believe in, really. It's wish fulfillment.
Hmm.
The spirit of vengeance rising to punish the guilty, that presupposes a world in which evil is punished, and which is to say, it presupposes a fair world, and that's not the world we live in. But I really like to engage slashers because they let me believe in that world for just a little bit.
The book has 3 sections. Section 2 is called Sweat Lodge Massacre, so people can figure out for themselves how it's going to end. And one of the characters says, nobody ever dies in a sweat, not even the elders. It's about the safest place in the Indian world. So how much of a transgression is it for you as an author to turn this sweat lodge into a bloodbath?
It is a little bit transgressive. At the same time, though, I think that, I mean, if any people who subscribe to traditional ways like call foul on me, then I think that's good. I think if you're making the traditionals nervous, then you're doing the right thing as an artist.
That's so interesting because you're saying it's good to make people who follow tradition nervous, but at the same time, this is a book in which people who violate tradition get punished.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So there's value in the tradition for sure. It's just if we lock tradition in place and freeze dry it, then that's the first step of killing it or dismissing it. It has to
Hmm.
adapt and change, which is why in that sweat, they're doing a sweat in their own ways. They're not singing the old songs. They're not doing it mechanically how it's supposed to be done.
This brings us back to the question we started with of what makes a good Indian. Is it like blind adherence to tradition, or is it interrogation of tradition, or is it disavowal of tradition?
I think it's just charting your own threshold for success and being happy, really. It's just, really it's just existing. We're not supposed to be around anymore. We were supposed to be erased in the 19th century, but here we are going strong. So I think if you're just around, then
Hmm.
you might be a good Indian.
Stephen Graham Jones, I really appreciate your talking with us.
Thanks for having me. It was an honor to be here.
His new novel is called The Only Good Indians.
The author Lisa Bird Wilson is part Indigenous, like her main character Ruby in her new book Probably Ruby. And in this interview with Here and Now Celeste Headley, she makes this important point that the violent history of the Indigenous people, that's not a burden just for Indigenous people to carry. It's all of our history, and we all gotta own it.
A young Canadian woman gets pregnant in the 1970s but is forced to give the child up for adoption, partly because she's an unmarried teen, but also because the father is a young Indigenous man. Her white adoptive parents try to keep her as far as possible from her Indigenous roots, and that's where the novel Probably Ruby begins. It follows Ruby as she comes to terms with her heritage, her self-destructive tendencies, and her search for her family. Author Lisa Bird Wilson joins us now, and congratulations on the novel.
Oh, thank you. Can say hello.
So let's begin with you, since there are some similarities. You are not Ruby, but you are Métis, from Saskatchewan. So is Ruby, and she spends her life from a very young age trying to figure out who she is. About a year ago, you published an article in the Globe and Mail that was called "I Found My Ancestors in the 1901 Census." It was a tangible reminder of colonialism's impact. Can you talk a little bit about the search, what it means to search for one's ancestors?
So, as an Indigenous adoptee myself, I share that with Ruby, right? So we were both adopted as infants into white families and, really disconnected from our roots and our ancestors and our family and that sense of, where we came from and how we belong. And so I wanted to have this fictional character, this contemporary embodiment of all of those colonial, violent histories that are part of Indigenous people's past and histories. I think for myself, coming to an understanding in my early 20s that I was not alone in this, that this is a story that I share with at least 20,000 other Indigenous adoptees from Canada. And it's part of this process of assimilation, that's been going on for centuries for Indigenous people. We sort of come to this shorthand way of talking about it. We call it the 60s scoop, which is a bit of an umbrella term for what happened across 4 decades of sending Indigenous kids into non-Indigenous homes to be adopted or fostered, to extend that agenda of assimilation that started with the residential schools. And it really isolated Indigenous kids into these white communities where you felt like you were the only one. And so I think it's really important for me in the book to demonstrate to other Indigenous adoptees and to people in general that we were isolated on purpose, and that there was a myth somehow that we had been, saved from troubled Native parents, and that we were not loved or wanted by our communities, which isn't true. And so, part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to show that Ruby is loved and she's wanted. And I tried to show the way that her birth mother is so lovingly wanting to imprint Ruby on herself, but also imprint herself on Ruby. So there's a part in the book where she takes off her pajamas and she takes off the baby's clothes and she just lays down with her and just has that connection with her because she knows this baby's going to be taken from her.
You have chosen to focus through a whole series of vignettes. There are chapters of the book that focus sometimes on different members of Ruby's family, different characters in her life, ranging for decades from 1950 almost to the present. You've chosen to focus on the after effects of these things. What happens after her grandparents experienced the Canadian schools for Native children? What happens after the young mother is sent away because she's become pregnant as a teenager? Why the focus on the aftershocks?
It's the aftershocks that impact us today, right? There's not anybody on this land who is Indigenous who doesn't have that history and that colonial violence in their past. And it's just a miracle that we're even here at all. But the other part of that I want to make sure is really clear is that this is also our shared history on this land. So this isn't the burden and the history for Indigenous people only. This is all of our history. This is what has brought us to where we are today.
There's connections in the book with some of the recent really horrifying headlines that have come out about Canada's history with residential schools. Both of Ruby's grandparents were sent to residential schools and clearly endured some abusive situations. I wonder what you think of all of these headlines that have come out recently about residential schools. For the Indigenous people of Canada, is the new information helpful? Is getting the word out helpful in any way?
Those little unmarked graves that have been discovered or rediscovered or relocated, right? Because our communities and our grandparents and our people who went to those schools understood that those grave sites were there, that Indigenous kids died. I think it raises a really difficult and painful past and reality, but it's not a surprise. And just a fraction of the schools have been looked at, so that gives you a sense of foreboding of what's going to come. When I think about, the 60s scoop, I think about the child welfare situation for Indigenous kids that's been going on for decades. I can very clearly see the line that goes from today all the way back into the residential schools and see how that same agenda, has been driving these policies and these relationships and this systemic discrimination all along. And it's that idea of, really seeing Indigenous people through a lens of white middle-class values that under and devalue Indigenous culture, Indigenous ways of knowing. And I think that Ruby, for me, is trying to just embody that contemporary view of what that's like to be an Indigenous person today and be dragging around all this history, even though Ruby ends up not necessarily knowing all of that. So the reader knows more about Ruby and this history and this background than Ruby ever really comes to know in the book, but it's still there. And we talk about intergenerational trauma and we talk about blood memory, And that's part of it, right? It's having that hard history and that hard background. But it's also, I think, really important for us to remember that that blood memory is also Indigenous joy. It's also about our ancestors, our place on the land, our cultures, our languages. It's the good parts of our history as well. And I think that we have to remind ourselves of that. That's a really important aspect of the history that we also take forward with us.
So there's also a strong thread of the importance of autonomy throughout the book, not just with her grandparents that were taken to residential schools, not just with how Ruby grapples with being kept away from her own history and heritage, but there's also the chapter that focuses on Ruby's birth mother, who is a young unmarried teen, as I mentioned, a white girl who is sent away to a boarding house for young unmarried girls against her will. She tries to run away. That entire chapter is just heartbreaking. And so one of the ripples that this book seems to be tracing is how casually autonomy is taken away and how the significant impacts of that travel through generations when you take away someone's freedom and their choice. In this book, did you want to also create the other side of that, valuing empowerment and making sure that one really grasps your choices when you have when you have options?
I think, there is very much that sense of fighting back in the book. So, you mentioned Grace and the ways that she asserts herself. Like, she gets the notion from one of the other girls in the home that maybe they can't make her do this and maybe she can keep this baby. So she holds on to the baby for 2 weeks after it's born, and they don't know what to do. Like, they're just flabbergasted by this girl who literally just won't let the baby go. That's Grace trying to sort of fight back and assert herself that way. But when I think about Ruby as a character, and she's got this big personality and she's got this attitude, I think somewhere in the book she thinks or says it's only worth it if it goes too far. Like, she's just a lot, right? She's big, she's bold.
She is. She's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and she has this great big laugh. And so she takes that laugh and she uses it in a whole bunch of ways. It protects her, she covers up her pain with it. But I think it also emboldens her. And I think that that's really important, that it drives her forward. And for me, in so many ways, I found that Ruby's laugh really emboldened me. So as Ruby's creator, I was made more powerful and more bold about it by being able to use that laugh, because it allowed Ruby to take off for me as a character and to really be able to go with her in so many ways instead of trying to control her. When I look back at it now, I can see how laughter and humor is so important to Indigenous cultures and to Indigenous people. Laughter has become this really important tool in our survival. So that laugh to me is doing a lot of things.
It's either laugh or cry sometimes, right?
Yeah.
That is author Lisa Bird Wilson on her poignant new novel, Probably Ruby. Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time. And again, congratulations.
Marcy, thank you.
And that's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. Let us know what you think. You can write to us at bookoftheday@npr.org. I'm Andrew Limbong. The podcast is produced by Miranda Mazariegos and Naina Rao and edited by Megan Sullivan. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Hafsa Fatima, Melissa Gray, Devin Schwartz, Todd Munt, Gabe Bullard, Eliza Dennis, Tinby Ermias, Emiko Tamagawa, Fatma Tanis, Jolie Myers, Mallory Yu, Elena Burnett, Karen Miller-Medson, and Jill Ryan. Beth Donovan is our managing editor. Thanks for listening.